The motivation for attempting to answer this question is severalfold. Number one, as the pandemic and quarantine wear on, we all know there'll be an adverse effect on both the local and national economy, but how big, broad, and long will it be? Moreover, and importantly, there is a trade-off between the economic harm caused by infections and death and the economic harm caused by the continued quarantine. But what exactly is that trade-off? Next. So this analysis will use the last major global pandemic, which was the Spanish influenza of 1918 to 1920, as the case study. And I will identify its human and economic toll on both Philadelphia and the national economy. I'm then going to take those historic results and update them to today, and then use the city's current demographic and economic parameters as inputs to the empirical analysis. The analysis will then conclude by presenting and discussing the potential economic impact of both the pandemic and the quarantine on Philadelphia's economy. Next. All right, so part one, why focus on Philadelphia as far as the pandemic goes? Well, we're a large US city, and therefore we serve as a comparable for other US cities, since the virus's impact has been most pervasive in dense urban areas like New York. Among large US cities, Philadelphia suffered disproportionately from the last global pandemic. We were basically the New York of the Spanish flu 100 years ago, and therefore we serve as a good urban case study. And lastly, I live and work here, so I care about what's going to happen. Next. All right, so we'll start with a little history. So until the current COVID-19 pandemic, the 1918 influenza one was actually the most recent and severe global pandemic in modern US history. Also, much like the current pandemic, it was caused by an H1N1 virus that had avian origins, and once it began, it spread at an alarmingly exponential rate. Next. Some pictures from the time. The first cases occurred in the spring of 1918, but it didn't become a global pandemic until the fall of that year. Next. And by the time it was over, it took the lives of 50 million people worldwide. There's some pictures from the time, and 675,000 of those deaths were here in America, compared to the 200,000 that they're expecting this time. And of course, we're pushing up against 100,000 right now. Think about it, was more than 6 times worse than the current one last time 100 years ago. So how badly did Philadelphia get hit? The answer, next, very, very badly. Next. We had over 12,000 Philadelphians were estimated to have died of the virus 100 years ago. 12,000. To date, we've had not even 1,000 deaths in Philadelphia from the virus. We're up to about 857. Right? We had 12,000 Philadelphians die during the last virus 100 years ago. There's a picture of men digging a mass grave for flu victims in South Philadelphia. Next. This chart shows the mortality rate in terms of deaths per 100,000 people of the Spanish influenza across US cities from the last pandemic. Next, we were second only to Pittsburgh in terms of the mortality rate. Why was Pittsburgh number one? I'm guessing that the air quality in Pittsburgh had something to do with it, given that it was a major steel manufacturing center. But like I said, among large US cities, we were basically the New York of the pandemic 100 years ago. Next. So why did Philly get hit so hard? Next. Because we made one very big mistake. Next. In late September 1918, just a few weeks after the first recorded cases of the virus were in the city, Philly decided to throw a parade on South Broad. The purpose of the parade was to boost patriotic support and invest public financing for America's involvement in World War I. They wanted to raise money for Liberty Bonds. They expected 10,000 people to show up, but instead, next, 200,000 people showed up. Here's a picture of the parade on South Broad Street looking north. At the top, you can see the south entrance to City Hall. And on the left, you can see what is currently the Ritz-Carlton Hotel today. And as you can see, the phrase social distancing had not been originated yet. Next. After that day, things escalated very fast. Just 5 days after the parade, Philadelphia experienced hundreds of new cases and dozens of deaths being reported each day. Here's a quote from a book that's considered the most influential study of the influenza at the time. Within 72 hours after the parade, every single bed in each of the city's 31 hospitals was filled, and people began dying. Hospitals began refusing to accept patients. Next. And those numbers would quickly grow to literally be off the charts. This shows Philadelphia influenza deaths by year from 1890 to 1930. You see the big spike during the 1918 to 1920 pandemic. When they first started creating this chart in 1890, They never expected the death toll could get so high. So this is before the age of computers. They couldn't rescale the y-axis, so they literally had to draw the number of deaths being off the chart. Next. So people began taking their own personal precautions. And it shows a family here standing on what would have been a precursor to a SEPTA platform here in Philadelphia at the time. And I'll bet you thought that people walking around in public wearing masks was something new. If you can see the sign that the woman's wearing around her neck, it says wear a mask or go to jail. Next. Then the city officials ordered all schools, theaters, and churches to close indefinitely. That was followed by mandatory closure of bars, pool rooms, and dance halls, which were things at the time. Hotels, barbershops, restaurants, and lunch counters were left open, but their employees were required to cease work upon the first sign of the flu. And then the city also initiated some public health campaigns. Next. Here's some pictures from the time. Apparently, 100 years ago, Philadelphians were really, really into spitting. They had signs all over the city saying, "Spit spreads death." You see one at the bottom, what would be the precursor to a septic trolley. On the left, you see one on a lamppost. That's on North Broad looking south. If you look in the background, sort of the haze there, you can see the tower on City Hall. At the top is a sign in the Philadelphia Navy Yard that's saying the Spanish influenza is spread by spit. We've had so many deaths so far, don't spit. And on the right, you see a poster from the Philadelphia Health Board saying, "Halt the epidemic, stop spitting at everybody." Yes, I see someone making a comment here. I'm guessing that the reason spitting was so prevalent was because the use of chewing tobacco was quite common at the time. Eventually, all public gatherings were prohibited, and there was such a severe shortage of medical personnel that the U.S. Surgeon General called in the Red Cross to assist Philadelphia. There's an ambulance in front of a house on Spruce Street. Next. Even back then, medical and scientific experts knew the importance of flattening the curve. This is a chart of the mortality rate over time comparing Philadelphia to St. Louis. Unlike Philadelphia, which didn't have a big parade, St. Louis also took much quicker, excuse me, and much more drastic action than Philadelphia. And you can see they successfully flattened their curve. Next. Here's Philadelphia's, excuse me. I've got a frog in my throat. All right, here's Philadelphia's death rate over time compared to other U.S. cities. You can see the big spike. Philadelphia is noted by the red circle there. You can see Philadelphia experienced more deaths in a shorter period of time than any other city during that pandemic. Pittsburgh might have had more cumulative deaths. You see Pittsburgh is next to Philadelphia there. It's on the left. But in a very short period of time, about a 6-week period, no other city experienced as many deaths as Philadelphia. Next. At the virus's peak, we had 759 people in the city die on a single day. That's in a single day. For contrast, to date, during this whole pandemic, we've had 857 deaths over about 7-week period. So we may have surpassed that 759, but they had 759 deaths on a single day. All right. At one point, 2,000 city transportation workers called in sick. So many phone company employees fell ill that phone calls became restricted to just emergency calls. When the city's morgue reached capacity, a local brewery actually offered its cooler to store 500 bodies. Next. And then 2 months after the pandemic began, the economic consequences began to be felt. Next. So starting in November of 1918, the Dow fell 47%, just about 2 months after that big parade. And that decline is only slightly less than how much it fell during our last recession, 10 years ago, the Great Recession. So this shows the Dow Jones Industrial Average from 1918 to 1921. You see the post-World War boom on the left, and then you see the basically 3 to 4 year decline of 47% once the pandemic hit, and it began in November of 1918. Next. After that, wholesale prices fell 37%, automobile production dropped by 60%, industrial production declined by 30%, and business failures soared by 300%. And even those businesses that survived still suffered an average decline in profits of 75%. And bank failures also increased from just 63 in 1919 to 506 by 1921. So a very, very severe economic consequence to the pandemic. By June of 1921, the national money supply had dropped 9%. This shows the U.S. monetary base from 1910 to 1923. Next, and you'll see the decline there in the monetary base, which of course basically drove up interest rates, something that actually we're not dealing with during this current one. We know we're expecting interest rates to remain low. Next. National unemployment rose from just 1.4% in 1919 to nearly 12% by 1921. Next, you see the big spike in the unemployment rate there. Next. This unemployment rate is very close to what it was during the last recession. There's a picture of the time of some men looking for jobs, so wearing a sign saying, wanted a job. Next. It's also estimated to have, the unemployment rates estimated to have been even higher in the densely populated cities where the virus was most prevalent. Some estimates found that urban unemployment could have been as high as 20% in some cities. And the downturn did not end until July 1921. Next. So to summarize, it was an unexpected and previously unknown avian flu struck a major US city and spread extremely quickly. Infections and mortalities grew at an exponential rate, and medical professionals thus realized the importance of flattening the curve. In response, the government forced non-essential businesses to close and encouraged people to avoid gatherings, and private individuals responded by wearing masks in public. Shortly after the pandemic began, the stock market began a significant slide downward, and a severe economic downturn subsequently occurred. Next. So, is any of this sounding or feeling familiar at all? Next. But fortunately, there's been a number of studies of the actual economic impact of that contraction, and that can hopefully give us some guidance on what we can expect as well as what we can do. Next. All right, so what does the research on the last pandemic tell us? So what I did is I went out and I did a comprehensive literature survey of every paper in a respected, reputable, peer-reviewed journal that analyzed the economic impact of the last pandemic and the recession that followed. This table summarizes that literature. It is a comprehensive survey. That is, no papers are omitted here, so I didn't cherry pick things just to get the results that I wanted. There was a total of 7 papers. The first column gives the site of each paper. Each row is a paper, and then the second column gives the main findings. So, for example, the study published by Vernon in July of 1991 in the Journal of Economic Inquiry found that following the pandemic, U.S. GDP declined by 3.5%, and that decline was the decline due to the pandemic. The actual decline was greater than that, but that's the decline he attributes to the pandemic. The second paper found that there was, on average, an 18% decline in state manufacturing output at the typical level of pandemic exposure across the U.S. The third paper found that businesses lost an average of $10,000 a day during the pandemic, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to take each of these results, update them to today based upon the expected death toll, and given our current employment levels and GDP levels at a local level, and see if the same thing, if the same thing plays out today as 100 years ago. What can we expect? Next. All right. So I aggregated these economic impacts. I converted them to impacts per 1,000 deaths by dividing the total number of deaths and the total population in 1920. I then applied these to a range of predicted casualties from the current pandemic in order to derive a range of possible economic impacts from the virus. Next. By the way, people are typing questions, but so many of you are typing them that no sooner does one pop up than it's immediately replaced by the next one. And so I don't have sufficient time to read it and answer it. So if I could ask if you could hold questions until the end, and then I'll do my best to answer them then. All right, so what is the expected mortality rate, total mortality rate from this pandemic? Well, there's the website 538 that's run by Nate Silver. If you don't know him, he's a very well-respected statistician. He does a lot of political polling, but his website has a lot of great empirical analysis on it. And they surveyed a whole bunch of medical experts in the US and asked them what expected range of deaths could we expect from the pandemic. And they asked each of them to give 3 numbers, not just one. What would be the best case scenario if everything works our way and we respond appropriately by quarantining as long as possible and so forth? What would be the worst case scenario if we did absolutely nothing to react to the pandemic? We just let it run its course and let the chips fall where they may. And then lastly, what do you think will be the actual death toll from the pandemic? So given our current responses. So each bar represents the answers from one medical expert, and the leftmost value of each bar represents their best case scenario mortality rate. The rightmost value of each bar represents the worst case scenario. And then the blue dot in the middle is their best estimate of what they think the actual death toll will be. And on the horizontal axis is the total death toll. So they did this survey a little over a month ago. The lowest estimate was 2,000 deaths, which we're already well beyond. We're up to about 82,000 deaths. The worst case scenario, which is that really big blue bar you see near the top, is a high of 2.2 million deaths. And again, that's based upon what's projected if absolutely no steps are taken to contain the virus or even treat the infected. Okay. Next, and then the blue dots represent their actual estimate of what they think the actual death toll will be. Next. All right. When I did this about a month ago, the range of projected fatalities ranged from a low of 2,000 to a high of 2.2 million. That's a large range, but the survey has a consensus, if you will, median prediction of 200,000 fatalities before this is all over. Moreover, that's within the range of the number given by Dr. Fauci, who has predicted we'll have between 100,000 and 240,000 deaths. So since 200,000 national deaths is basically close to the midpoint of that range, I'm going to go with that number as the most likely number for fatalities before this is over. And remember, we're up to 82,000 now. All right, so now on to the actual analysis. Next. All right, empirical results. So part one, the effect on Philadelphia's GDP and output per capita. Next. So the first study I cited, Vernon's 1991 study, found that for every 1,000 deaths from the virus, that was associated with a 0.005% drop in national GDP. So if I apply that result to Philadelphia's annual GDP, which is approximately 121 billion, and we have a GDP per capita of about 76,000, we get the following chart. So on the horizontal axis, I've got the number of national COVID-19 deaths in the thousands. And then on the vertical axis, I've got the dollar loss in Philadelphia GDP per capita. And as you can see, the orange line declines from left to right because as the national death toll increases, so too will the local death toll, and that's how GDP is predicted to decline. So if we have 200,000 national deaths, that's projected, and it applies the same way to the next recession as it did during the last pandemic. That's projected to reduce Philadelphia's GDP by about 1.25 billion, and that works out to about $789 per person. Okay, next. So now we'll look at on the effect on Philadelphia's manufacturing output. Next. Again, I did the same thing here using a Korea's study. They found that every 1,000 deaths was associated with a 0.037% drop in state manufacturing output. Philadelphia's share of Pennsylvania's manufacturing output is 0.6%. I apply that result to get the following chart. So again, if we have 200,000 national virus-related deaths, that's projected to reduce Philadelphia's manufacturing GDP by about 311 million, and that works out to a loss of about $14,357 for each person that is employed in manufacturing. So take your annual manufacturing wage, give it a $14,000 haircut, and that's the hit to manufacturing that we can expect to take as a consequence of the virus. Next. So I'll move through the rest of these fairly quickly here, just focusing on the results. So next we'll look at the effect on businesses. So businesses declined 40 to 70% during the downturn. Median decline was 55%. There were about 38,000 business failures during the last downturn. And by the way, we're only looking at businesses with employees here. So we're not looking at sole proprietorships or family-run businesses. So these are businesses with at least 5 employees. Okay, next. All right, Philadelphia's share of all U.S. businesses with paid employees is 3.5%. We've got about 21,000 registered businesses with employees. They have the following characteristics. Total receipts of about 167 billion, 610,000 employees, about a 32 billion annual payroll. So then we'll apply that business failure rate from the last pandemic to these numbers. We can derive the following implications. Next. So every percentage point drop in business revenue was associated with 680 business failures nationwide. And again, only business with employees. Philly's share of U.S. businesses is 3.5%. We get the following chart. So again, on the horizontal axis, I'll always have the number of national COVID-19 deaths. And then on the vertical axis, I'll have the economic impact that we're looking at. So this shows the number of businesses in Philadelphia that are projected to fail as a result of the national pandemic. If we have 200,000 national virus-related deaths, that's projected to cause 389 Philadelphia businesses with employees to fail. And that may not sound like a big number, but remember, these are only businesses with at least 5 employees. If just one of those businesses is Comcast, that could be all it could take to, really push us over the edge. Next. All right. Now we'll look at the impact of business failures on business revenues. So again, here's how business revenues in Philadelphia are projected to decline. If we have 200,000 deaths, that's projected to reduce business revenues by 3.1 billion. That would be a loss in BERT revenue, business tax revenue to the city of about 4.4 million. Next. If we look at how that will affect unemployment, if we take note of the fact that the average Philadelphia business with employees has 29 paid employees, then given the national number of COVID-19 deaths, this will show how many people will be thrown into unemployment. At 200,000 deaths, that's projected to increase business unemployment by a little over 11,000 people in Philadelphia. Next. All right, the effect on our poverty level. Next. So one of the other studies found that every 1,000 national deaths from the last virus was associated with a 0.05% increase in a county's poverty rate. Our current poverty rate is 25.7%. So this shows the increase in the number of people who will be thrown into poverty as the national death rate increases. Again, if we go with the consensus forecast of 200,000 national deaths, that's projected to increase Philadelphia's poverty rate from about 26% to 28.3%, which is an increase of a little over 40,000 people that would be thrown into poverty if our poverty rate rises by that much, 40,000 people. Next. Effect on capital income. So I'm going to define capital income as basically income that's not wage income. So this will be dividends, interest, rent, coupon payments from bonds, things like that. So one of the studies found that every 1,000 national deaths was associated with a 1.48% decrease in a county's total capital income. Total capital income in Philadelphia is 11.6 billion. That's, again, rent, interest, dividends that are collected. So the chart shows the loss in capital income per capita as national deaths increases. Anything more than 70,000 nationwide deaths, which we've already surpassed, is predicted to drive annual capital income in Philadelphia, which is a little over $7,000 per person, to zero. So that's over the course of 1 year. Now, how could it be that big? Well, think about it. If the stock market takes a loss and municipal bonds aren't paying and your tenant defaults on the rent, well, then you're collecting zero capital income. So that's a pretty severe hit. Next. All right, the effect on wages. Next. So the last virus found that the study found that the last virus, for every 1,000 deaths that happened, it was a 0.24% decline in wages. Philadelphia collects 1.6 billion in wages from about 687,000 people each year. So this shows how wages per employee will decline as the national death rate increases. At 200,000 deaths, the typical Philadelphia-based worker is expected to suffer a loss in annual wages of about $28,537. If that occurs, the city will suffer a loss in wage tax revenue of $762 million. By the way, I was on another call this morning, maybe some of you were on it too, with the development workshop. Steve Mullen from Econsult presented, and he said that Mayor Kenny's office has reported that the city is expecting to take a $650 million loss in tax revenues this year as a result of the pandemic. It would rise. This study predicts that would rise to $762 million if wages suffer by that much. Next. All right, so the housing market, the one you've been waiting for. Next. Now here, identifying the impact of the pandemic on the housing market 100 years ago was challenging for two reasons. First of all, there were no studies or analyses of the last pandemic on the housing sector or just even on the broader national real estate market. And moreover, I couldn't really conduct a study myself because there's no publicly available housing data from that period at a sufficiently detailed or granular level that would make such an analysis possible. So we had to be a bit more creative on this one. Next. So, although it may not be empirically possible to measure the direct impact of the last pandemic on the housing market, it is possible to identify the impact of the pandemic on the main drivers of housing, and then apply those results to the current period, and we'll see how the changes in those drivers can and will affect the housing market. So, what are the drivers? Well, it's very well established in the housing economics research literature that two of the primary fundamental drivers of house prices are population and income. Right? Population and income. And there's a citation from the IMF if you want to verify that for yourself. But I'm guessing most of you are aware of what the drivers of housing are. Next. There are, of course, other fundamental drivers, but I don't think they're as germane to the immediacy of the current situation. Interest rates are a key factor, but they're near zero and are likely to stay there. Inventories matter. We all know they're near record lows, but they tend to be more of a short-term cyclical indicator than a fundamental long-term one. Taxes and regulations certainly affect house prices, but they're unlikely to experience any fundamental changes in the near term. Moreover, they tend to vary more across cities than within cities over time. And then, of course, on the supply side, you have the drivers of housing starts and the cost of development. But new construction was basically banned for a while. It just recently restarted, and it's at a fairly slow pace. And the cost of construction is going to basically remain where it's at. There's no reason to believe that the pandemic itself will directly affect the cost of development. The cost of sheetrock, the cost of wood, things like that. Next. All right. So I'm going to focus on how the pandemic caused changes in population and incomes could affect Philadelphia's house prices in the following way. First, I'll look at the effect of population decline due to virus-related deaths, and I'll treat that as the direct effect of the pandemic on housing. Then I'll treat the effect of income declines as household income declines due to the recession that the pandemic is causing, and that will be treated as the indirect effect of the pandemic on housing. So next step is I have to identify and quantify how population changes and income changes affect house prices. So to identify the correlation between those, I collected data on changes in those three things for 20 large US cities that are comparable to Philadelphia for the years 1990 to 2018. Next. So here's a scatter plot comparing house price growth on the vertical axis to the percent change in population growth on the horizontal axis in those 20 cities, all right? And clearly you can see that the association between population growth and house price growth is a positive one. As cities grow in population, their house prices go up. That's the dashed line is the fitted regression line. You can also see not only is that relation positive, it's exponential. So as population may increase linearly, house prices first grow fairly slowly, but then at an accelerated pace as population growth increases. You see in the very top center of the chart, there's a thing called an R squared. That's a diagnostic statistic used in regression analysis. It takes a value from 0% to 100%. And basically, the closer you are to 100%, the greater the statistical relationship is between the variables you're examining. So it has a value of 59%. Translating that literally means that changes in population over time explain nearly 59% of changes in city-level house prices. So clearly, population growth is a key factor in the driver of house price evolution over time. Next. So now we'll do the same thing for income growth. So here's, again, a scatter plot, only this time on the horizontal axis, I have the percent change in median household income in each city. And then on the vertical axis, I've still got the percent change in house prices during that same period from 1990 to 2018. Again, you can see the relationship is positive as well as exponential. As household income grows, house prices grow, but the house prices grow at an increasing rate as income growth increases over time. More, we have also a very strong R squared. We have a value of nearly 42%, which literally translated means that changes in household incomes over time explain nearly 42% of changes in city-level house prices over time. All right, so some pretty strong empirical results here. Next. All right, also, note in both cases that Philadelphia is located either on or very close to the fitted regression line. So I'm highlighting where Philadelphia is relative to the regression line. It lies almost exactly on it. That's a good thing for our analysis. It has very strong and positive implications for forecasting the effect of population and income changes on Philadelphia house prices, because the mathematically fitted relationship, which is represented by the dashed line, is especially strong for Philadelphia, as opposed to, say, Denver or Cleveland, which are located relatively far from the fitted regression line. So basically, it says here, the model here is especially applicable to Philadelphia. Next. Okay. So we'll combine those results now by, I'm going to run a simultaneous regression of house prices on both population growth and incomes at the same time. The regression has an R squared of nearly 68%, it's highlighted in yellow, which indicates that changes in population and household incomes over time collectively explain 68% of the changes in house prices across US cities over time. All right, so some strong results. Next, we'll talk about the coefficients. All right. The T statistics indicate that there's very strong statistical strength here. So this regression meets the professional standards of statistical significance. So therefore, the relationship between population growth, income growth, and house prices is not a spurious one. It's actually a very strong and real one. Next. All right, so I'll get to the coefficients here, which is the important part. So highlighted in yellow on the left-hand side, I've got two variables, population growth and income growth. They have estimated coefficients of 1.67 and 0.48 respectively. Those are rounded numbers. So what do those numbers mean? That means a 1% increase in a city's population is empirically associated with a corresponding increase in a city's house prices of 1.67%. That's what the data says. House prices go up by 1%, the general level of, population grows up by 1%, the general level of house prices in your city goes up by 1.6% on average. For income growth, a 1% increase in a city's median household income is empirically associated with a corresponding increase in a city's house prices of 0.48%. So if household income in your city goes up by 1%, on average, you can expect house prices to go up by about 0.5%. All right, next. So now we need to, that also means the converse of that is true. 1% declines in each of those things will result in declines of 1.67% or 0.48% in house prices. Next. So then we need to, the next step here is to apply these results to get a forecast of the likely range of changes in our house prices given the predicted changes in population and incomes due to the flu. So first I have to derive a range of population declines, which is deaths due to the virus. So again, if I go back next, if we go back to that study that gives the forecast of national deaths, we're going backwards here. All right, keep going. So I'm going to take Philadelphia's share of U.S. population, keep going, and assume that our share of the national, we'll have some share of national deaths that is proportionate to our population share of the national population. And I'm going to create 3 different scenarios: a pessimistic, optimistic, and baseline scenario. Next. Yeah, this study's online. If you want to get deeper into the numbers and the methodology, I kind of want to focus on the results on this and save some time. So like I said, I'll create 3 scenarios based upon our Philadelphia share of national deaths. Next. And then I also have to compute the impact of declines in income on the value of the city's housing stock. So I'm going to take the total percent decline in the level of house values as the sum of the percent decline in prices due to the drop in population, that is virus-related deaths, and the percent decline in prices due to a drop in citywide incomes due to the recession. I'm sum those 2 numbers to get the total percent decline in city house prices. All right, next. All right, so here we go. So on the horizontal axis now, I've got the number of Philadelphia COVID-19 deaths in thousands, not the number of national deaths, all right? For the baseline scenario of 200,000 national deaths, Philadelphia is predicted to suffer 962 deaths. And by the way, we're up to 856 now. So if we suffer 962 deaths and we have a recession as severe as the last one, that's projected to result in a drop in the value of the city's housing stock of 71%. A 71% decline. That's a big number. And that would also result in a loss of real estate tax revenue of $1.1 billion. Next. And how much does that work out to the decline in the typical value of a typical home? That's a loss of the value of a typical home of about $118,000. If we hit 200,000 national deaths and 962 local deaths, as well as a recession as severe as the last one. Next. All right. For the other scenarios, pessimistic and optimistic scenarios, the results were very similar. Next. All right, let me give you a few comments on those results because those are some big numbers, all right? First of all, in general, it needs to be noted that insofar as the pandemic will affect house values, the biggest impact will come from declining incomes rather than declining population. So it's the recession you should be worried about, not the death rate. That's because the existing research indicates that the percent decline in incomes, which will be caused by the recession, is projected to be far larger than the percent decline in population, which will be the deaths due to the pandemic. So in other words, insofar as you're concerned about housing, it's the recession you need to be concerned about far more than the fatality rate, because that's where the hit on housing will come from, is the decline in household incomes, not the increase in the, or loss in actual population. All right, next. All right. Even in the worst case scenario, where Philadelphia is projected to experience over 35,000 deaths, I don't want to be callous here, but that works out to, quote unquote, only 2.2% of the city's population. And even though that death toll would be terrible, 35,000 deaths, still a 2.2% decline in your population, especially if it's mostly seniors that are living in assisted living facilities, it's just not a big enough percent change in the city's population to significantly move the needle on house prices. But by contrast, the percent loss in incomes is very large for any of the scenarios. Total wage income is projected to fall by 53%, total capital income by 47% across all Philadelphia households. I mean, you cut everyone's annual income and their savings, their wealth in half, you're going to get a big decline in house prices. Next. All right, so let's stress test those numbers and do a little cost-benefit analysis. So my cost-benefit analysis is going to be done by comparing the total economic cost of each scenario, which is the numbers I've already given you, to the projected demographic benefit, which is the number of virus-related deaths that the quarantine measures and work stoppage are expected to prevent. All right, next. So again, I derived 3 different scenarios: a baseline scenario where we have 200,000 national deaths, an optimistic scenario where we only have 45,000 deaths. Again, we're already at double that, so we've already passed that hurdle. And a pessimistic scenario based upon that survey of experts on the 75th percentile projected deaths is 605,000 national deaths. Remember, we're up to 82,000 already. All right, so based upon that range of deaths, what are the results we can expect? The range of economic outcomes. Next. All right, so this table gives the total economic cost to Philadelphia of the COVID-19 pandemic by scenario. So on the left-hand side, I've got the different economic outcomes based upon the research literature survey, the hit to GDP, hit to manufacturing, loss in wages, loss in house values. And then I've got the 3 different scenarios: pessimistic, baseline, and optimistic. If you look at just the baseline scenario, that's nearly 1,000 Philadelphia deaths, $1.25 billion decline in the city's GDP, $31 million decline in manufacturing, nearly 400 business failures, 11,000 unemployed people, 40,000 people thrown into poverty, loss in wages of 20 billion, and a loss in house values of 81 billion. So as the chart indicates, as the table indicates, the expected economic cost of the city is estimated to be well into the billions. I should emphasize these numbers are not in just one short period of time, they're over multiple years. So however long the pandemic and the subsequent recession last, that's the total cumulative losses over that period. So, if insofar as there's some good news here, these losses will be amortized over, I would think at least 3 to 5 years. Next. All right, so like I said, 3 things can be discerned here. The cost will be very large in the billions. For any scenario beyond the optimistic one, they're catastrophically large, tens and even hundreds of billions if we get to 600,000 deaths. Moreover, the cost increases exponentially as deaths increase. So even if the number of deaths increases at a linear rate, the economic costs increase at an exponential, that is an increasing rate, which should make sense. I mean, if you suffer just a few deaths, you shouldn't expect a big impact on your economy, but you start getting to hundreds of thousands, something like that is definitely going to have a large impact. All right, so that's a stress testing of the results. Now we'll do a cost-benefit analysis of that. So are there any gains from this? So, like I said, the numbers in the previous table represent the expected cost of the virus, and I'm going to measure the benefits by the expected number of lives that are saved due to the public and private measures taken to prevent its spread. So, particularly the work stoppage and the quarantining, wearing masks. Those are the measures we're taking, and hopefully those should be preventing some deaths. So those are going to be represented by the benefits, of those measures. Next. All right. So again, I based it again off this chart. How do I estimate the number of lives saved? It's going to be the difference between the blue dot and the rightmost level of the bar. So remember, for each medical expert that was surveyed, they were asked, what's the worst case scenario? That's represented by the rightmost value of the bar. That's if we did absolutely nothing, took no measures against the virus. The blue dot represents what their expected total number of deaths will be. So the difference between those two numbers implicitly represents how many lives they think will be saved by taking the measures that we're taking. Okay, next. All right, so for example, if the median prediction is 200,000 national deaths, but the worst case scenario, if we took no measures to contain the virus, is 2 million deaths, then basically what these experts are saying is that they think the measures that we're taking will save 1.8 million lives. So there's just a mathematical example. 1.8 million lives are being saved by these measures. Next. All right, so here's the different outcomes by scenario. So again, I got the 3 scenarios: pessimistic, baseline, and optimistic. So the first row gives the number of expected deaths in Philadelphia under the 3 scenarios. So under the pessimistic scenario, we're expected to experience nearly 11,000 deaths. The baseline scenario, 962 deaths, which we're very quickly closing in on. We're at 856 deaths in Philadelphia so far. Under that scenario, the number of potential Philadelphia deaths is 5,770. So the difference between those two, the number of potential deaths and the number of actual deaths, is 4,808. That's how many deaths have been prevented by the measure. So that's the benefits of the quarantining and the work stoppage. The total dollar cost of Philadelphia, again, from my previous results of the baseline scenario, is $135 billion. So if you divide the number of deaths prevented by 135 billion, the total cost per death prevented is about $28 million. All right, $28 million is how much it costs to save one life in the baseline scenario. That works out to a total cost for Philadelphia households of about $250,000. And the total dollar cost for Philadelphia household per death prevented is about $48. So for every life that is saved due to the work for you not working and staying quarantined, it's costing you personally about $48 for each life saved. So the total dollar cost of Philly is computed as the sum of lost wages, lost capital income, and lost house value. Most of those other indicators I looked at, like poverty and so forth, are basically included in those 3. So the pandemic's total economic cost of Philly is estimated to range between $31 billion and $400 billion. That works out to a range of a cost of about $51,000 to $700,000 for each household in Philadelphia. Remember, our median household income is about $46,000. But again, I need to emphasize these numbers are over multiple years. They're not all at once. They're over 3 to 5 years. Next. So then we'll divide those costs by the number of deaths prevented, and that gives the dollar cost to the city of each life that is saved. So how much is it costing the city to save a life by basically not allowing work or transportation or gatherings? It ranges from a low of about $7 million to about $39 million. That's the cost per life saved. That's not the total cost of all the lives saved. for each life that is saved by these measures, these drastic measures, it's costing about $7 to $39 million per life. Like I said, I don't want to be seen to be insensitive by putting an explicit dollar value on a human life, but I think it is reasonable to point out that most people don't make between $7 and $39 million over the course of their lives to cover those costs. So again, that means to make up that revenue shortfall, the city's going to have to borrow very heavily to bear it, since it won't be able to tax its way out of paying that bill. Next. All right. So lastly, I took those results and I created the following cost-benefit chart of the pandemic. So on the horizontal axis, I've got the dollar cost to each household in Philadelphia of the pandemic and the subsequent recession. Again, these are all based upon the previous numbers I gave. And then on the vertical axis, I've got the benefits, which is the number of deaths prevented as a result of the work stoppage and hence, bearing these costs that the recession will force upon us. I've only got 3 data points in this, but look how high my R squared is. It's nearly 98% with just 3 data points. So I take that as meaning that, that these results are pretty credible and serious and thus have some serious empirical substance to them if you get such a high R squared with just only 3 data points. Next. And again, notice that as the number of deaths prevented increases, the number of costs we have to bear to save those lives grows exponentially. And again, most of that dollar loss does not come from the direct cost of containing the virus's spread. That is, wearing masks and whatever it takes to support our medical facilities. Most of that dollar cost comes from the opportunity cost of preventing most of the population from working. So the real cost is coming from the work stoppage and the quarantining, as opposed to what it's costed, just putting people up in hospitals and administering tests and other medical measures to help people recover from the virus. So the real cost is coming from the shutdown. Next. All right. So let's sum these up and give some discussion of the results. So the analysis indicates the economic impact of the pandemic could be quite large. I want to emphasize could. This is not predicting what will happen, but what could happen. Like I said, I am most emphatically not predicting what will happen, but rather what could happen. Because the outcomes that are projected in this analysis, and they're big, but they're very, very heavily contingent upon 2 very big things. First of all, we need a very large U.S. death toll. We have to have at least 200,000 national deaths to get anywhere close to the economic costs that are projected in this. And we're only up to, like I said, 82,000. So we have to get at least 200,000, more than double where we currently are. And we know that we've leveled off to get anything close to these numbers. Second, this analysis also implicitly assumes that our national economy and local economy reacts to the death toll in a similar manner as it did 100 years ago. So we have to react to this death toll in a similar manner in order to again, get those very, very big numbers. So 2 very, very big contingencies in this analysis. Next. So examining the likelihood of both contingencies occurring. Next. As of this writing, like I said, there's been about 82,000 national deaths from COVID-19 in the US, 856 of them in Philadelphia. But like I said, the rate of infection, as well as the rate of mortality, appears to have peaked both nationally and locally. So I've got the number of Pennsylvania COVID-19 cases on the left-hand axis. And you can see it looks like it did peak a month ago. In fact, it dropped dramatically just in the last 2 days. You can see a downward trend there, is noted by the red circle in the number of cases. On the right-hand side, I actually have the actual death toll from the coronavirus. This is from our friends at the Inquirer. This shows cumulative deaths over time from the pandemic. And each color-coded segment of the bar represents a particular county in the region. And the tan component, which is the part that is highlighted, has the numbers on it, are the number of COVID-19 deaths in Philadelphia. I fitted a logarithmic exponential curve to this. And again, you can see that it appears the death toll is still growing, but it is growing at a much slower pace than it was a month ago, which appears to have been the pandemic's peak. So it appears to be leveling out. Next. Now, what will happen after the quarantine ends? Will it start rising again? I don't know. Like I said, moreover, the death toll from the pandemic 100 years ago was not only much higher than the current one to date, but it was higher in both absolute and relative terms. Remember, 100 years ago, we had 675,000 national deaths. They're predicting 200,000 from the current one. So even if we get to 200,000 national deaths, that's still less than a third of what it was 100 years ago. Less than a third. All right. Next. And don't forget, the population of the U.S. 100 years ago was smaller than it is today. We were 106 million people 100 years ago, 330 million people today. So the percent of the population that was lost in the last pandemic was 0.64%. If we hit 200,000 deaths from the current one, it's 0.06%. So a fraction of what it was 100 years ago. And I don't want to, again, be callous, but a 0.06% loss in your population would not seem to be most, entirely devastating from an economic perspective, especially, again, consider that most of those deaths are disproportionately elderly people or people with pre-existing conditions or, are just unhealthy to begin with. Next. All right. Also, most economists actually disagree on to what extent the last economic contraction of 100 years ago was caused by the pandemic. Here's some quotes from the peer-reviewed research, including the papers that I cited earlier. So factors that have been pointed out as potentially causing or contributing to the 1920 to 21 downturn include troops returning from the war. It was right after World War I. That created a big surge in the civilian labor force and hence more unemployment and wage stagnation. There was a decline in agricultural commodity prices because of the post-war recovery of European agricultural output. That increased supply and hence reduced prices. There was tighter monetary policy 100 years ago to combat the inflation of 1919. That's something we're not expecting now. We're not expecting the Fed to run interest rates up to 7% like it did 100 years ago. And there was also expectations of deflation that led to reduced investment. And that's pointed out as one of the reasons the stock market declined 100 years ago. It wasn't just due to the pandemic. So bottom line, there were multiple factors pointing to why the recession of 100 years ago was so severe. It's not all the fault of the pandemic. There were some other things going on. Next. Government policy also had a part in it. Federal spending was slashed from fiscal year 1919 to the fiscal year 1920 by 65%. So 65% reduction in federal spending. The national budget was pushed down. And like I said, the New York Fed raised its discount rate to a record high 7% by June 1920. So those are two very big things we're not expecting from this one. If anything, our government's spending like crazy and we have interest rates near zero. So one of the reasons that recession 100 years ago was so severe was also not only due to other outside factors, but also government policy that appears to have exacerbated the severity of that recession, namely slashing federal spending and hiking interest rates. This time around, we're increasing spending and we're holding interest rates near zero. So that's one reason to believe that this recession will not be as severe as the one from 100 years ago, is because government policy is not reacting as adversely to it this time as it did last time. Next. But here's a little more good news. Even though most economists disagree on how much the Spanish influenza was to blame for the 1920 to 21 downturn, they generally do agree that that downturn 100 years ago was sharp, but it was short. Right? It was short. And the recovery that followed it was quite robust. So here's some more quotes from a number of both expert and reputable sources, including some of the very authors whose previous research was cited and used in this analysis. Next. The Panic of 1920 started out as a contender for the greatest depression of all time, but the economy corrected itself within 2 years. During this short depression that lasted from 1920 to 21, the depression of 1920 was a brief economic depression. The depression of 1920 was notable not only for its quick turnaround, but also for its absence of political and monetary intervention. And the pain was acute, but the pain was brief. Next. And a few more. Most of the evidence indicates the economic effects of the 1918 influenza pandemic were short-term. However, the recovery from that recession was very quick. The economy rebounded quickly and expanded strongly thereafter. And the economy rebounded quickly from the 1920 to 21 depression and entered a period of quite vigorous growth. Next. And the one study from the previous pandemic that I cited, but I actually didn't use, found that despite the severe mortality rate of the last pandemic, there was actually a positive economic effect, believe it or not. How could that be? Well, here's the actual quotes from the study. It was published, it was a discussion paper presented at a conference. Although the death toll exacted by the pandemic was one of the highest recorded during a health crisis in world history, their study found a large positive effect of the mortality on economic growth over the next decade across the US states. And their results indicate a large and robust positive effect of the influenza pandemic on per capita income growth across states during the 1920s. Now, how could an influenza result in higher than normal economic growth? Well, here's what they claim to have found. Next. The reason they found that is because the reduction in labor supply that was caused by the pandemic, that is the number of deaths, that reduced the labor supply because people died. And because the labor supply was reduced, that increased the negotiating power of workers, and hence they were able to negotiate, increase the price of labor, i.e. wages. So because the labor supply was reduced by pandemic-caused deaths, wages went up as a result because the labor supply was reduced. And those authors claim that that effect is one of the reasons that the quote-unquote roaring 20s were so roaring. So here shows the Dow Jones from 1918 to 1930. You can see the depression of 1920 to 21 in the middle. There's that dip. And then after that recession, the Dow rose 500%. Its biggest increase in its history up to that point. Now, we all know what happened after the 1920s ended, but yeah, that's a different story. Next. Because that downturn was so short and the subsequent boom so large and so long by comparison, it's actually now referred to by most economists as the Forgotten Depression. And one guy even wrote a book about it, James Grant. You can find the book on Amazon, The Forgotten Depression, 1921, The Crash That Cured Itself. And I hope we're as lucky with the impending one. Next. All right, so what are the key takeaways? Summing up, again, the empirical results indicate the economic costs of the post-pandemic recession could, emphasis could, not will, indeed be very large. Estimated potential cost to Philly is expected to range between 31 billion and 411 billion. That's all in the form of lost income, lost housing wealth, lost tax revenue, and reduced public services. For the typical Philadelphia household, that works out to a range of between 52,000 as much as 692,000 over the course of both the pandemic and the subsequent recession. Again, I want to emphasize that those numbers are over the course of about 3 to 5 years. Now, the actual benefit, which is the deaths that are prevented, that's the counterpart to that cost, is numerically large, but it's also very expensive. So the number of deaths expected to be prevented is estimated to be in the range of between 4,000 and 11,000. Remember, compared to, we've suffered less than 1,000 deaths in Philadelphia so far. But the benefit of this lockdown and quarantine is that we're expecting between 4,000 and 11,000 lives to be saved. However, if you divide those aforementioned economic costs into those numbers, 4,000 to 11,000, that implies that the cost of the city of each death that is prevented ranges from a low of about 7 million to a high of about 39 billion. So that's each death that we're preventing we're taking an economic hit between $7 and $39 million. And again, since most people don't earn that much over the course of their lives, especially those who are already elderly or infirm, that implies Philadelphia will have to borrow heavily to bear this cost, since it won't be able to tax its way out of paying this bill. Next. But again, I want to emphasize these numbers are heavily contingent upon two very large assumptions. We need at least 200,000 national deaths. Again, we're up to 82,000. We need at least 200,000. And the post-pandemic downturn will be as severe as the last one of 100 years ago. And remember, government policy today is reacting to the pandemic much differently than 100 years ago. We're not running interest rates through the roof and slashing spending. We're doing the opposite. So as of the time of this writing, I wrote at least one of these assumptions would seem to be overstated. I think they're both overstated. Next. However, one thing that is very different about this pandemic that's different from the last one is the massive work stoppage and self-quarantining. During the last pandemic, although Philadelphia forced many businesses that were places of large social gatherings like bars, restaurants, and theaters to shut down, there was no evidence of anything resembling the scale of the current shutdown. And again, I think that would seem to make intuitive sense, since most jobs 100 years ago couldn't be done from home. There was no internet, no computers. Phones were, very limited. Only rich people had them. So during the last pandemic 100 years ago, most people still reported for work. And most people still reported for work, even if they did so with some trepidation and caution. Now, again, they had a much higher death toll last time. I'm guessing that the fact that it wasn't such a massive lockdown had something to do with it. But we have a very large-scale self-quarantine this time around. They didn't do that 100 years ago. So that's the big variable in this, the big unknown. What will the effect of the quarantine be, and especially how long will it last? Next. So let's look at the duration of the last pandemic to help inform us about the expected duration of the current one. And we can derive some implications for how long we should maintain the current quarantine and work stoppage. So here's a chart from the last pandemic. They made this back in 1925, and it shows cumulative deaths over time by US cities from the pandemic. So on the vertical axis, it's got the percent of the population dying in each city. You see Philadelphia's at the top there. And then look at the horizontal axis. Hit next. It should move in a red circle. All right, keep going. All right, keep going. All right, look at the horizontal axis. It has, go back, please. All right. It has weeks prior to and following the week of greatest mortality in each city. All right. So at the leftmost value, you see -3 on the horizontal axis. The rightmost value is +3. So that's a total of 6 weeks. 6 weeks. So during the last pandemic, the vast majority of deaths occurred in a 6-week period. Although officially the pandemic lasted 2 years, over 90% of the deaths occurred in a very intense 6-week period in each city. 6 weeks. And we're up to basically week 8 in our quarantine now. And again, we're seeing the same signs of leveling off. All right. We're seeing the same signs of leveling off in both cases and fatalities from the pandemic. So that again implies going forward, the cost of continuing to maintain the quarantine gets ever more expensive, because if you're saving fewer lives because the death rate has leveled off, then but the economic cost of being quarantined remains the same. You're amortizing the economic costs of the quarantine over fewer and fewer lives saved, which means the quarantine is becoming very, very expensive, very, very expensive. Next. All right. So to compare the current cumulative fatality rate from the pandemic to the last pandemic, I fit a logarithmic curve through the current death toll in Philadelphia to the data, and then I divided the total deaths over time by the total population of Philadelphia to convert the death toll from the number of deaths to the percent of the population that has died. And that's, again, based upon the Inquirer's data. Next. So hit next. So there's, see that red line at the bottom? That's the red line from the previous slide. That's our cumulative death toll to date as a percent of our population. And you can see how we compare to the death toll the last time during the same 6-week duration, same 6-week period, as well as to other cities. Our current loss in population has been 0.046% compared to 0.8% during the last pandemic 100 years ago. And as you can see how low that red line is compared to what the line was 100 years ago, we've gotten off pretty easy so far. We've gotten off pretty easy. And you can implicitly assume the difference between those two lines represents the benefits of the quarantine. So the reason the red line is not as high as the black line is, again, at least partly attributable to the quarantining and the work stoppage. But again, as the death rate levels off just due to the virus's own rate of burning itself out, continuing the work stoppage and quarantine is going to become very, very expensive. Whether or not you would consider it to be unnecessarily expensive, that's a matter of personal judgment. That's not for me to make. Next. All right. So also historical commentary from that time also supports the assertion that the primary duration of the pandemic was approximately 6 weeks. Again, although the pandemic officially lasted 2 years, most of it occurred in a very intense 6-week period. So although the parade that initiated the widespread infection was on September 28th of 1918, by October 9th of the next month, there was an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer that had the headline, "Signs of Epidemic Wearing Itself Out." And here's another quote from a story on the pandemic at the time. By mid-November, again, just about 2 months after that parade, the epidemic had mostly subsided in Philadelphia. On November 11th, Germany became the last of the Central Powers to sign a ceasefire agreement, ending 4 years of warfare. World War I ended, and thousands of Philadelphians, once again, flooded the streets in celebration, and there was no major resurgence in the flu. So think about it. The big concern now is, if we end the work stoppage or quarantining or even start easing it, we could see a second wave in deaths. What happened 100 years ago? They suffered a much higher death toll than we did during the 6-week peak of the pandemic, but World War I ended, and people were in the streets partying like crazy, and there was no major resurgence. There was no major resurgence in the pandemic. Next. All right, so summing up, results from the influenza of 100 years ago suggest the economic consequences from the current one could indeed be severe. But again, I want to emphasize those results are heavily reliant upon 2 major assumptions, of which at least one appears to be increasingly questionable. But the numbers also suggest that the economic consequences of a prolonged work stoppage and self-quarantining would also be equally, if not more severe, than the direct consequences of virus-related deaths. So the demographic costs of the pandemic may be real, but the economic costs are very, very real as well, especially as the quarantine continues. And that's going to be especially true if the duration of the quarantine exceeds the duration of the actual pandemic, as suggested by the relatively short duration of the last pandemic's core, which was 6 weeks. So again, if the death rate's dropping on its own, but you continue the work stoppage and quarantine, the economic costs start to rise non-linearly. It starts to become very, very expensive to maintain that because the benefits are so low relative to the costs. Next. All right, lastly, the implications for housing are that the indirect effect of the pandemic, which is the recession, are going to be much greater than the direct effect of the pandemic, which is the population loss. So therefore, the duration of the lockdown and the work stoppage should be of key concern to our industry. It should be of key concern because that's where the housing is going to come from. Next. Bottom line, the results suggest that policymakers and elected officials should be conscientious about the magnitude of potential economic losses due to containing the virus, which is the quarantining, as they address the potential losses due directly to the virus itself, deaths. So what I'm saying here is that the economic costs of the pandemic are every bit as real as the demographic loss. And we should be using this information appropriately to plan on an adaptive response tailored to the severity of the crisis. So just to leave you with an editorial comment, next. 2 quick ones. Number 1, yes, the virus is real and it can kill you, but poverty can kill you too. All right, poverty can kill you too. What happens if you become homeless and you're living on the street? What happens if you're malnourished because you can't afford food? You're susceptible to all sorts of things. What happens to rates of suicide as people become bankrupt? What happens if you can't pay your health insurance and you get sick? So yes, the virus can kill you and should be taken seriously, but poverty can kill you too. And secondly, I may not be qualified to speak about the pandemic. I'm not a medical professional of any type. I am an economist. But as an economist, I can tell you that there is not a single example in history of any society or country making its population healthier by making its population poor. So I think that the economic costs of the stoppage need to be a greater part of the public conversation, as much as talking about the number of lives saved and preventing the number of cases of occurring. So with that, next. I thank you very much for your time and your patience for this rather long presentation. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. We'll get to the questions in the chat box now, and then I will unmute people as these questions are read. And Noah is back, so I'll unmute him too.
So do we have a scheduled time to wrap up? It's 12:09 right now.
Yeah, so we're scheduled until 12:30, but let's keep the questions to about 10 minutes. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I'd be grateful. This is the second time I've had to do this presentation today, and it's barely past noon and my voice is tired.
Sure. Okay. Noah, I'm trying to unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, great. All right, so let's go to the question box. All right, Aaron Osgood, what economic actions did the government take in 1918 compared to today's stimulus, boosted unemployment, etc.?
Again, it did the exact opposite of what they did today. Spending was slashed and interest rates were increased. Now interest rates are low and spending is increased. Whether or not that's good or bad, depends as much probably on your personal politics as it does any objective economic observations. A lot of economists believe that those were the wrong measures to take 100 years ago because they resulted in a very severe a depression that was much more severe than it had to be. But at the same time, a lot of economists have defended those actions by saying, basically, we ripped the Band-Aid off. So like I said, the depression 100 years ago was a severe one, but it was also very short. So this time, if the opposite happens, we would have a milder recession, but it would be a longer one.
All right, great. And then Andrew Gismondi, what was the total population of Philadelphia in 1918 versus today? You definitely hit on that, but it's probably worth repeating.
It was about 1 million. I mean, we're at 1.5, 1.6 million now. So it was 1 million 100 years ago. So remember, they had 12,000 deaths last time in Philadelphia. We're up to 856. But because that was divided into just 1 million people as opposed to 1.5, the actual death rate was much higher from the last depression. And that chart I showed you near the end of the presentation of cumulative deaths over time certainly indicated that, because that showed the percent of the population in each city that died due to the virus, as opposed to the total number of people. And it was much, much higher in percent terms 100 years ago.
Great. All right. A question from Michael Kaufman. With the lack of economic stimulus and the threat of increasing property tax, business and city wage taxes, what is the outlook for mixed and commercial properties across the city?
Yeah, the outlook on commercial properties is very bearish, especially relative to residential. Residential, I would expect to actually hold up better than commercial, because if you're out, everyone's going to be working from home and you're quarantining. You still need someplace to do that, and that's your house, that's your home, that's your apartment. So that would actually support, keep vacancy rates low and support house values, house prices, rents, and the like. Commercial, I'm very bearish on that. The worst sector is hospitality and tourism. They're absolutely getting slammed. The extent to which that will work out, or what the actual numbers will be, depends on, again, how quickly we'll be returning to work and how willing we are to, be back in offices working again. I can tell you, when I did this presentation last week, it was to a very large suburban industry association in our western suburbs, and the commercial brokers out there, like in King of Prussia, are salivating at the prospect of attracting all the tenants from Center City out to a lower density environment where they get cheaper rents. It's a smaller space, and there's lower density, so people are would feel more comfortable working in an office environment than they were in some high rise in Center City.
All right, great. And then we have Min who has a question. Min, I'm going to unmute you so you can give your question to Kevin.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for your presentation again, Dr. Gillen. So I wrote, I think I answered my own question by looking at your charts, but you stated that the multiple R, when you ran your simultaneous regression of housing prices on population and growth and incomes, you found that the regression had an R square of nearly 68%, indicating that changes in population and household incomes collectively explain 68% of the houses change price modifications over across the United States and US cities. The correlation between the variables values and the predictions on the predictive variables is on the multiple R is 82%. How did you establish 82% on the coefficient of multiple correlation?
Where are you getting 82% from?
On the regression statistics, you had a multiple R of 0.82 and an R square of 0.679.
Yeah, the 0.679 is the number you want to go with. I don't know what the 0.8 is. So 68% R squared. So collectively, incomes and population growth jointly explain 68% of the path of house prices over time.
Okay. Yeah, and above the R square, so I'm going to focus on R square. Above the R square was the multiple R of 0.82. I didn't know how you got that amount.
That's not one of the numbers I was looking at, so I don't have the slide in front of me. I can't answer that. If you want to email me separately, I'll see what I can do.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, do we have any more questions? Someone want to put them in the chat box or give me a little wave here? If not, all right. So no other questions. I just want to say thank you so much to Kevin Gillen for getting on here today. And we have the next Education Week presentation tomorrow. It's going to be a panel with Noah Ostroff. So that's at 11 a.m. Tomorrow. And thanks
so after all that content, there's only 3 questions? Was it that comprehensive, or is everyone just so depressed that they just want to get off this call and go have a drink?
Drink.
Min, weigh in.
Break time, guys. It's noon.
All right, well, bring me back when I have some good news to share, because that's a lot more fun for me too, as well as you.
All right, will do. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
All right, be well. Thank you.
Bye, guys.